Hello, everybody. I think we're going to start now. I'd just like to introduce, first of all, I'll introduce myself. I'm Liz Sly. I'm the Beirut Bureau Chief of the Washington Post. I spent many years covering Iraq, but it's not my full-time job anymore. However, I do go back there from time to time, and I was there most recently earlier this month. I was quite shocked to find how pessimistic Iraqis are. I'd been hoping to write a fairly optimistic story about Iraq finally putting the worst of everything behind it and perhaps moving on. I found Iraqis far more gloomy and pessimistic than I'd possibly imagined. The protests were just starting to get underway. They gathered momentum as I left. The issue of services, jobs, the economy is of course huge. You've got signs that ISIS is coming back. And a big complaint of the people I spoke to there was the Hashid al-Shabi, or the Shia militias, or the Popular Mobilization Units, or whatever you want to call them. They complain that to get jobs, you have to have a contact in the Hashid al-Shabi. Even if you're out at night, you might run into checkpoints that will shake you down. They complain about bribery and corruption in the ministries, and you can't and the people there have powerful connections in the militias. Even if you have a traffic accident, one of them said to me, you have to be careful, you can't do anything or say anything because the person you ran into or who ran into you might have a connection to the militias. It's a big source of complaint. We saw a lot of the anger of the protesters directed against the officers of some of the political parties of these militias. And whatever happens going forward, this is going to be a huge challenge for Iraq. These militias were there before Saddam, under Saddam, before ISIS, and they're still there today. They're getting more powerful. As we saw, they did pretty well in the elections and are going to play a huge part in the formation of the next government. So this is the subject of the paper that we're here to discuss today, the existence of this non-state actor embedded in the Iraqi state is going to be a huge challenge going forward. And it's the subject of the paper that HICO women of the International Crisis Group worked on, Renad Mansour of the Chatham House in London, and Yazid Saya, who did not write the paper but is here to critique and discuss it. Welcome. And Heiko, I would like each of you in turn, starting with Heiko, then Renad, then Yazid, to say what you think is the highlight, the most important point of this report, and the takeaway that you'd like people who read this report to take away with them.
Sorry, I'm just trying to get a distance.
Okay.
Okay, is this on? Does it work? Actually, good. Huh? Yeah, it is. Okay. Yes, thank you, Liz, for coming, for being the moderator of this panel. Thanks for Yazid to be here, be a commentator, be a host as well. I'm not sure if Maha is also here. Thanks to Maha in absence for hosting this event and for making this center into a place in the region where we can speak about these things, which there are not so many places in the region of, and it's very valuable that this exists, and I very much appreciate the work that Ma has been doing, that you are doing, that the whole Carnegie team is doing this, of creating this place right in the middle of Beirut. My apologies for being late, or rather for making this event start 7 minutes after 4 and not at 4. I was dutifully reminded that I'm not living up to my national reputation. I'm German. And, but I have an excuse, which I hope is not too lame, which is that I actually brought the physical report. That's why I'm late. It's out there, it's being laid out now, so whoever wants to take a hard copy, do the very traditional thing of actually reading something on paper, can do so. We have copies outside in English and in Arabic. I suspect that some of you also came because of the recent headlines that you mentioned, the protests in Iraq, in the south in particular, but also some in Baghdad, as far as I know. And for those, we have a surprise, which is that we have a briefing on the protests, which also is from should I say, the pen or the keyboard of Renad. about this protest in the south. I'm not sure if we have a physical copy of that one as well, but there's a pre-release copy, and if I send it to your colleague, he was going to see if he could print a few copies as well. I'm not sure if it worked. If it doesn't, then the pre-release copy is available for anybody who's interested, embargoed until tomorrow. Can email either me or Renat to get a copy. One reason I just want to say, I'll leave the highlights to Renat. He's the author of this article. I just want to clarify the relationship here at this point. We are the International Crisis Group. We have staff, we have analysts, but often we also contract, hire, cooperate with scholars, experts who can contribute to our work from outside the organization, and Renat is one of them. And Renat is the author, the lead author of this report. We don't often say lead author because very often it's a collective effort, and then we say pen holder. So many people contribute, one holds the pen. In this case, I actually say lead author because Renat really wrote the whole thing, did all the research, and we did the editing, and maybe a bit more than the editing, but mostly the editing. But all the highlights, all the ideas are his originally, so I'm not going to steal them from him. One reason why we also like to do this here, why we thought it would make sense to do this here, apart from Carnegie offering this space, apart from Beirut being the city that it is where you can actually debate these things. And we're going to have a second event in Baghdad later. We're also going to present the report. One reason why we're also doing it here, because some of this actually makes sense in this environment too, I think. And I mean, it goes beyond the very obvious superficial parallels, is that Iraqis don't have electricity, we don't have electricity, or we still have more than they do, but at least in Beirut. But we sharing that trouble. Iraqis don't have water, we don't have water, in the water richest country of the region. Beirut, the city of Beirut, the capital, gets water 2 times a day. There's a bit more, and I think there's a bit more of a superficial parallel for that, which is a general puzzle and problem that we find when a state-building project is created around power sharing, a principle of power sharing, often combined with identity politics, that then ends in something that I like to call competitive state capture. Various political forces competing to capture the state. Successfully so. And the result is, of course, that we don't have accountability, we don't have oversight, since the oversight institutions are captured as well. We have bad governance, and we have no politics, in the sense that at some point, as we've seen here in Beirut, as we're seeing in Baghdad now, people get mad, good reason to, they go to the streets, but there's no political process, there's no way, there are no channels and no mechanisms to how this anger and how the will for change can actually be fed into the political system in a productive way. And then either it ends, it just disappears again, or in some cases it can become destructive. And we've seen now in Iraq, for instance, the interesting phenomenon that one of the leaders of the important personalities of the Hashd al-Shabi, Hadi al-Amari, whose offices, the offices of his organizations were torched, goes out on a podium and says the protests, I mean, we support those protests. People are right. It's a verdict against the political class. And yet he's part of that elite that exists. He's becoming part of the political class. So the Iraqis are now in front of this challenge of actually introducing yet another originally non-political actor into this political system of theirs, and doing so, integrating these organizations or these groups within a system that is profoundly broken. And that is a profound challenge. And Renat will now present to us his ideas, our ideas, but mostly his ideas about how to deal with this challenge, how this challenge can in the long run, become something that leads to a better, or at least functioning Iraqi state.
Thanks. Should I?
Yes,
Yeah,
you should.
okay. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. It's good to be back at Carnegie. Liz, I'll answer your question in a way to kind of feed into what Heiko just said. What is the big sort of deal of this report? What's the kind of focus of it? And fundamentally, what it is trying to kind of digest a bit what the Hashd al-Sha'bi is. I've spent a few years now working and trying to understand these groups, including a report that I wrote with Falih Abdul-Jabbar for Carnegie a few years ago, which really, what we tried to do was understand how it's not monolithic al-Hashd al-Sha'bi is, the Popular Mobilization Units. We tried to understand who are the groups that make up the different sort of leaders or different parts of the Hashd, both Shia and sort of other sort of Sunni and minority groups. Moving on from that, now that we think that the narrative has changed a bit so that the media is not, I hope, no longer just saying the Shia militias as one thing, the next step has to be, well, what are they doing? Where are they going? And it's been really interesting to look at the evolution of the way they, the Hashd leaders, view themselves and view their role vis-a-vis the state. Fundamentally, the argument that the report makes is that you cannot separate security from politics and from economics, that the Hashd have a role in all of this. But where I think the report diverges from what would be some typical policy recommendations is the focus, if we're talking about the Hashd, if we're talking about the future of the Hashd, should not be about the Hashd only, but it's actually a bigger problem, right? The Hashd is not the only group in Iraq that is a political party that has an armed wing and an economic wing. In fact, some groups that are political parties that have armed wings are supported by the West and trained and funded by the West. So, and these are arguments that Hashd leaders tell me. They ask, why is it that we're always the bad people? Why are we always kind of in trouble? Everyone else in Iraq is doing the same thing, right? So it's not to say that, and the stories that you said are true. I mean, you know, there are obvious problems with different armed groups linked to the Hashd al-Sha'bi, but the same thing can be said across the board. And I think that's an important way to approach this, because instead of singling them out as such, we need to understand what it is. And really what that means is that it's a problem of the unitary state, right? So they're not a non-state actor. They're not a state actor. They're not a, they can choose and pick, and they are both a state actor, a non-state actor, a hybrid actor, whatever you want to call them. But fundamentally, what I'm saying is they blur that line, and it's important to kind of dig into that to understand how. To me, the big change in this process came in November 2016 when the Iraqi parliament legitimized al-Hashd al-Sha'bi as an independent military organization under the Prime Minister's office. So before that, when I would meet, integration was still an option. They would always have these ideas of battalions and how to move into the state. But since then, they're a bit more comfortable because their role is being carved out as an independent military organization supporting the political process as they put it, or the political process as they deem fit, but nonetheless independent, and that's an important word in all of this, that they're under the PMO, but the PMO doesn't always have as much centralized command. And since then, what you've really seen is a solidification of the Hashd as a sort of security body funded by the state. Now again, when I say that integration is off the table, one must also look at some other precedents. So one of the things we look at is the CTS, the Counterterrorism Service. Iraqi law says that the Ministry of Defense and Ministry of Interiors are where the armed forces go. Nouri al-Maliki in 2007 took the Counterterrorism Service out of the MOD and put them under the Prime Ministers. At the time, it was viewed as the personal army of Maliki. But since then, particularly since the fight against Daesh, the CTS has become a legitimate army, a legitimate counterterrorism force. But legally, it still has the same standing in that it has a ministerial level position under the Prime Minister. So here you have a counterterrorism force that's head considers himself to be on a ministerial level, right? Hashid, they look at this and they say, well, we're kind of like this too. So they're able to play with legal nuances because there's no unified central command and because there's no sort of state there. And that's the kind of gist of the report. If you look at politics, many of the leaders of the Hashid, when you ask them, are they becoming politicians? As Liz said, they were politicians before. Hadi al-Amri was the Minister of Transportation previously. Ahmed al-Asadi, all these names, they were members of parliaments who, in their eyes, they took a sabbatical to go fight against Daesh, and now they're coming back. But what is true, and we see from the recent elections under the Fatah list, is that they do have some sense of popularity in the south, where they won many of the provinces, and they gained 47 seats. They're very close to Muqtada al-Sadr's list. So they do have a base, and they have carved out, and they are political. Even though, you know, it's really interesting for me to see individuals who once used to wear military outfits, now when you meet with them, they're wearing suits, and behind it's not the Hajj al-Sha'bi, but it's Fatah. And they're trying to draw the difference, but nonetheless, it's clear that this is a political and military organization that's run by several different parties. And as I say, the strongest parties are the ones that we associate with the Badr organization, Kitab Hezbollah, As'ab Ahl al-Haq, and Harakat Hezbollah al-Nujabat. These are some of the bigger groups. These are the groups that have the most power. Now, it's an economic force as well, right? So it receives funding from the central government, from the Prime Minister's office, but it also takes over, as the report shows, different contracts, particularly outside the city. Checkpoints are very lucrative, and it's doing just like anyone else, making money off of these different types of businesses, and I think this requires further sort of research, as we were talking about the sort of economics of it. But it also wants to provide services. So where the state is no longer able to fill in, the Hashid will fill in. And the example that we use in the report is the garbage contract in Basra, where all the protests sort of started. There was a company, the national company, that was unable to pick up the garbage. And I know that's a sympathy held in Beirut as well. So what the Hashid did was they decided to take the contract. They haven't received any payment for it, but they did it as a way for sort of popular, I suppose, public diplomacy. So they use the funding that they're getting from the central government or from their own economic ways, but they're also looking to gain support in services, right? So they are trying to fill in. So I think, I mean, depends what you call them, but certainly they at times cooperate with the state, and at other times they compete with the state. Right? And so one has to look at when do they cooperate and when do they compete with the state. And I'll conclude, I suppose, with some ideas of sort of what we try and come up with. First of all, the biggest challenge has been the central government, I suppose, led by Haider al-Abadi, the prime minister, has had no clear vision on what the Hashid should be. At times, he says that we need to integrate these groups and that, you know, we will integrate. But at other times, he says they have martyrs and they are the future of Iraq and they'll be there. So you don't have a single policy from the state as to what to do with the Hashid. And in that blurred lines, the Hashid are able to kind of course, maximize their interest and their powers vis-a-vis weak leadership in Baghdad. A note on the protest movement, it's important as well. Until now, a lot of the Hashid leaders were gaining favorability for being able to provide services that the state no longer provides. But as they enter the political process, and I think Sadr is also learning this, and you're also unable to fulfill the basic needs, water, electricity, employment, the Hashid will increasingly face problems. And they're already facing internal problems as fighters return home and realize that the Hashid can't provide them all with salaries or retirement packages. So there's already sort of that issue of ex-combatants moving forward. In terms of what will happen to the Hashid, we know they're an autonomous force. One idea that they really are happy with is to become a sort of national guard because they don't have the technical skills or the capabilities as, say, the CTS or the army. They don't have that kind of training, but they're quite happy to leave the cities and serve as a national guard in the different governorates. They also, keep in mind, include minority groups, Shabak, Christians, and in fact, one of the Hashid leaders, Sheikh Rayan al-Kildani, won 2 seats out of the quota seat from the Kitab Babylon. So they also have minorities who are becoming national guards in different parts of the country. So that's the model moving forward, but fundamentally, the conclusion of the report is To understand the Hashid and then to offer policy advice to the Hashid is to try and understand what's going on throughout the whole country and offer policy advice for the sector and how the Hashid fits into that. Sorry, that was longer than I wanted it to be.
So I'll start by saying this is a superb report, and I found it very informative. I'm sure this is going to stay where it's meant to be. I hope that's still going to pick up.
Do you want to use this one?
They'll manage it. Islam. Now, I want to start from something that Renad said, and that is the bias, the assumption that the Hashid Shabi are a problem and no one else in the country is, or not to the same extent. And of course, implicit in that is the idea that the Hashid Shabi is seen as a pro-Iran proxy, and that's what makes it problematic. And only in the second order is the issue for many observers and for policymakers in Western countries, among others, who are concerned with having a unitary state with a unitary army or unitary security and defense sector. And the idea that you've got a parallel army is problematic from that normative perspective. And it is a normative perspective. The idea that you could have a dual military institution is seen as fundamentally problematic. But if you look around the region, this has actually become a fact of life in quite a few Arab states. In Lebanon, we have a semi-formal duality, which has been pretty much formalized, if not fully legalized, since the early 1990s with Hezbollah as a parallel army, to the extent that the national dialogue on defense strategy was designed in order to provide a way of squaring the circle of how do you have a national army and a parallel army at the same time. But we've got other examples. Clearly, Libya after 2011 developed a new parallel structure of the Libya shields. So you had a dual army and a dual police force. We've seen pretty much the same under different guises in Yemen. Syria, obviously, we've had many militias on both sides of the war, but we, on the regime side, had a situation where the regime itself sponsored the creation of loyalist militias. So it itself created a dual parallel military, which it's now trying to bring back into the form of the Army Fifth Corps in the Syrian case, but which will remain some sort of special formation because it includes paramilitaries, in other words, people who are not trained military personnel, but who came to this, in the conditions of war. And so what's happening in Iraq is not unusual in that sense, this duality. And what I want to try and suggest is that we step back a little bit for a moment from our preferences. I mean, I would not dispute that it's better to have one single unitary national armed force rather than two. But the point I want to make really is that duality is often the outcome of conflict, or it's part of a post-crisis political settlement, and therefore often becomes a permanent feature of a post-crisis settlement. If you look around the region at other countries that have dual militaries, we often think of Iran as an example and the nearest to Iraq, and the one that's most mentioned in reference to the Hashid Shabi example in Iraq is, of course, that Iran has a regular army and the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. Saudi Arabia also has a dual military that goes even further back to the formation of the Al Saud Kingdom, and it's part of the political settlement that allowed Al Saud to consolidate and stabilize control within the country by creating a regular armed force, but in parallel, what was originally a tribal armed force, the National Guard. And that also ultimately reflected the balance of power within the Al Saud themselves between, King Abdullah and his son's line versus the Sudairi brothers. And there are others. Sudan, Oman, both have parallel popular defense forces. In the Omani case, these were the ex-rebels and the ex-counterinsurgency forces of the 1970s that have become permanent as a parallel military force. and in Sudan, the Popular Defense Force, which emerged from Turabi, the Islamist movement, and the 1989 coup that brought Omar al-Bashir to power, and has now become a permanent part of the overall defense sector. So what's happening in Iraq, in the sense of the creation of a dual or multiple armed force structure, is in fact actually pretty typical of nearly half the Arab states. So first, I'm proposing that what is happening in Iraq is not unusual, it's not exceptional, it's not just about Iran, and it's likely to be long-lasting. So we might want to start thinking about, if it is likely to be a permanent feature of the Iraqi state, then how to accommodate it in other ways that maybe allow it not to be a dangerous phenomenon. And I think one point made in the report, as you'll see once you read it, I hope, is that recognizing the autonomy of the Hashid Sha'bi by turning it into something like a national guard or whatever other specific formula is found is maybe something to be accommodated, that in itself is not necessarily dangerous so long as it clearly comes under the state, which means, of course, that it comes under the regulatory and operational frameworks of how recruitment is done, entry to officer school, the expectation that all members should have professional training, should be part of a clear financial structure in terms of pay, benefits, pensions, that this is part of a broader plan placed presumably by the Defense Ministry, Finance Ministry, and others to ensure financial sustainability of the undertakings. You know, when you take 100,000 men or 48,000 men or whatever onto the payroll as full-fledged civil servants or as employees of the state, then you've got a lifetime expectation of salaries, sick pay, and pensions, of course. So all these are the kinds of burdens that every country faces, and faces especially in its military sector, because often the military pensions bill is one of the largest single budget items in most countries. This country faces the same kind of problem. Jordan faces a huge military pensions bill because it's got about 160,000 military retirees on top of the 100,000 or so in service. So this is a very common pattern. The question is, how can the Hashid Sha'bi and similar armed forces or paramilitaries, as Renad mentioned, that exist in Iraq, like the Peshmerga and others, how can they be brought into a single structure that allows for diversity? After all, many countries have parallel militaries. The United States has a National Guard, which comes under the local states until and unless needed by the federal government. So there are many countries that have this, but they provide for it in, with proper regulatory frameworks, accountability, transparency on budget, etc., training, rules of engagement, military justice codes, etc. So the real challenge, I think, for Iraq is not so much the attempt to dissolve the Hashd al-Sha'bi, really, and I agree there with Renad, and maybe even with some of the leaders of the Hashd al-Sha'bi who say, why pick on us alone? The question is, how to accommodate that in these other ways. And I'll wrap up by making a couple of references here to other things in the context of Iraq. One is, of course, a real danger is that unless the Hashd al-Sha'bi and other armed actors are brought within a state-controlled regulatory framework, then there is the risk that the same weaknesses of the state that allow duality in the security defense domain will replicate, let's say, in financial management and economic management and elsewhere. And if you go back to the Iranian example, this is also something we see in Iran, where the Revolutionary Guard Corps started out as a force that could be relied on, that was ideologically committed to the new Islamic Republic and would defend it, whereas the old regular army couldn't be, wasn't trusted as much. But over time, the Revolutionary Guard have become a major economic player as well, and therefore have a whole parallel series of ministries and bunyads of agencies that control massive economic assets. And so I think that's one of the risks that we have to worry about. It's not just about what happens to security, but also what happens in other areas if the first isn't controlled and brought under a proper framework. And finally, let me remind you also that the phenomenon of the Hashd, and I think the paper and Renat's presentation bring this out beautifully, the relationship between the military and the political natures of this thing I think this is typical of many other actors in Iraq and in other Arab countries, where the weakness of the state, the decline of the state-society relationship or the social contract, the decline of national identity, means that in many Arab countries today, in order to be a political player, in order to conduct politics, you have to also be a military actor. In other words, violence has become a form of politics, and it's being civilized in a place like Iraq by forming a competing political military force like Hashd al-Shabi or Peshmerga in the Kurdistan region and elsewhere. But we have this in Palestine, we have it in Lebanon, we have it in Syria, in Libya, in Yemen, and in other forms in a few other countries. So in other words, we're talking about a crisis, a deeper crisis of our states, societies, and national identities, which mean that violence is a central feature of our politics. And therefore, the possession of the organized means of violence becomes a fundamental feature of political systems and how politics is conducted. So I think that, if you look at Iraq and you look at the experiment or the experience of the Iraqi Kurdistan region since 2003, where it came very close to independence, and yet it is fundamentally handicapped by the fact that their own army, the Peshmerga, is in fact deeply divided still after many, many years into two rival Peshmergas that don't merge with each other, have not integrated, won't work with each other. The ministries split down the middle of Peshmerga. The intelligence services are similarly split. And that is an example of a country that should have been far more advanced in its democratic practice and so on than the Saddam state. But it's ended up simply being a smaller version of the state run from Baghdad. And I'll stop there.
Well, thank you. For my first question, I'm going to ask perhaps Heiko and Renad, you could give an answer, and then Yazid answer the second part of the question, or just discuss it amongst yourselves as you like, which is, it might be stepping backwards a little bit, but it's the question I most often get when I talk to people who have not been to Iraq but are interested in it and are watching it, which might apply to some of the people here, which is it's taken as a given in the comments you made that these Hashid Shabi are under the influence of Iran. And as you said, this is one of the big reasons why they're seen as problematic. I think it would be useful to explain a little bit the extent of the Iranian influence on the Hashid, and I think the report explains this very well, that there are some groups that are Iranian influenced and are directly and only answerable to Iran. Of course, there's a large segment of the Hashid that is not. They responded to Sistani's call. I'd wonder whether you see all of the Hashid collectively as equally problematic going forward for the Iraqi state as a problem to be solved, or are we only talking about the Iranian-influenced ones? And Yazid, in terms of what you're talking about, the sort of inevitable existence, perhaps post-conflict, of parallel armed structures or different armed structures within the state, does the fact that some of these groups at least are so answerable to Iran, can you have somebody under the state that's also getting their money and their influence and their politics from Iran, or is that an umbilical cord that would have to be broken, or can it be broken? So, Heiko, why don't you?
Well, I think as Yazid has pointed out, I mean, first of all, it's a normative problem that you have potentially different military formations. You have separate chains of commands answering to several people who then are all playing in the political game, and who can wield this capacity. Maybe don't even have to use it, but as long as everybody knows capacity exists, they probably don't have to. And from that from this normative problem come pragmatic problems. I mean, if you have this position that basically puts you outside accountability, even more than the others, then of course you can proceed to start building your own economic backyard, and then maybe that will grow into an economic empire. You may be able to acquire, one could say, unfair advantage in competition, and in certain places when it comes to government appropriation, government work. So I think that the big challenge here is, and these are all problems that Iraq, as you know and said, that Iraq already has. So the question is, if we now have these organizations continue to exist as parallel army, parallel military forces, whose subordination under civilian oversight, under the state framework is at least in question, whose loyalty is in question, then we add to this already these layers of governance trouble that the Iraqi state already has. So you basically you add one more corrupt network potentially on the already existing ones and allow it to entrench in the political system and gain even more influence and weight. So from that perspective, I think the question, I mean, they're all equally problematic. And whether or not they then also answer to a foreign agenda adds yet another layer of problems. But I think the first problem is they're outside control, outside the central state oversights. They're additional different sources of power that can be used to twist the Iraqi state away from anything that resembles proper governance, right? And then, I mean, for the Iranian ones, for the question, I'll leave that to Renat, yes, who has described that in the report very well. But it also has to do how old they are, right? How long they have existed. Do they exist before 2014? What their different histories are? Some answer to different parts of the Iranian hierarchy as well, right?
Yeah, the Hashid who responded to Sistani's call remained under Sistani's control, and in the field, when you went out to the battlefronts, you could see they were operating directly as auxiliaries of the Iraqi army. They didn't have this independent presence like the others. Are we seeing a problem with those ones too, or is the sort of political, economic, military structures just building up around the old militias that do answer to Iran with the political, and did exist for a long time?
Yeah, no, I think you're right. There's about 7 of them that we highlight, which are the ones that existed before 2014, which are the ones that will likely continue to exist no matter what kind of integration process. The ones that came to defend the 4 shrines or to support Sistani more sort of directly, I mean, they're all, in their view, answering Sistani's fatwa, even though the fatwa was very clear. But the ones who claim to only be sort of based on they're quite keen to sort of, pack up and go home if needed. Also, the ones that answer to Sadr are, Sadr has also come out at different times and said, we need to get rid of the weapons on the streets, but of course he's one person who has always had armed groups in support, so one can't sort of see how that scenario, when I kind of push them on it, when I'm speaking to some of these who are quite sort of keen to stop, so why don't you just give them in? The thing they'll say is, well, if we do, then the others will still have them, so it's not fair. So it's one of those sort of problems, I think, that you have, that some of them want to integrate, some of them want to remain autonomous, but they're still in it together. And on the question of Iran, well, first of all, there is a bit of autonomy. I mean, you have different levels of Iranian support. So you have some of the groups, like Hezbollah and Nujabat, which are very clearly and happy to say, we support Iran in Iraq, and we go to Syria to support Iran. And there's no, I mean, they don't try and hide it. They're not involved in the Iraqi process, political process. Then you have other groups like Badr and As-Sa'ib, who are kind of known to be close to Iran, but had to kind of tie down the Iranian sort of bit of it in order to win elections in Iraq, because it's hard to be very close to Iran and win an Iraqi election. So they're kind of changing their discourse. But, whether they're proxies, whether they're allies, I think fundamentally one of the lessons that's been learned since 2003 in Iraq is, if you have to choose a sort of foreign patron, then perhaps the one that has the most better track record of being successful is Iran. because American allies have had troubles, Gulf allies have had troubles, but these groups that have been very close to Iran have been proven to gain autonomy, and that's the way they view it. So this is Iran's game. Iran, the way it wants to control the Iraqi state is to have multiple levers and to control multiple facets of the state, so that if there's a problem in one section, they can use these groups. So Iran is very close to the Ministry of Interior, different ministries, but also to the sort of paramilitaries and other groups. And also Iran has Kurdish allies. The PUK is quite keen. So I mean, this is the way that I think Iran moves forward. But I think the question on, and Yazid's point is really, really important here, which is some of these groups that existed before aren't going to go away. And what they've done since 2014 is legitimize themselves to the point now where you would need a judicial overhaul because they're legally recognized. So the question becomes, as you say, and as a lot of the protesters are saying in Iraq today, which is, we don't just want to change in leadership, but this system needs to change. And muhassasa is what they're using to prove it, but they're not just interested in leaders, they're interested in a complete overhaul of the system because of these problems.
Well, I think Renat's covered a part of the question addressed to me. No, that's great. It means I can reduce. But I was simply going to, well, first to say that I don't think this is a matter of Iranian funding and that, what are the implications of having an Iranian-funded force, because Iran's approach generally is to reduce their costs and to intervene, whether in Syria and Iraq, at minimum cost, and to devolve a lot of the actual effort to others. And in this case, the real challenge and the whole, the sort of a sustained effort by the Hashd Sha'bi has been to be recognized by the Iraqi state, given legal status, and therefore to shift the burden of their cost onto the state budget. So, I mean, if there is any outlay, it comes from the Iraqi state, not from Iran. But I think the other thing that's important here is that the Hashd, as Renat has just pointed out, and as the report details, is not all pro-Iran. I mean, there's a lot of internal difference there, and it's going to be very interesting to see how that evolves over time, because if Hashd remains in existence, it'll ultimately emerge into a more homogeneous force somehow. Because if you think back to the Revolutionary Guard in Iran, back in the early days of the revolution, there were immense factional struggles, bloody struggles that led to the deaths of thousands of people. And the Revolutionary Guard of today didn't start this way, as homogeneous and united, any more than, I guess, the National Guard did in Saudi Arabia. So, in other words, I'm saying that the current disunity of the Hashd Sha'bi internally, its diversity, may over time evolve into something else if it remains in existence. But the other thing is that the Hashd is not the only instance of some force, whether domestic or external, taking over a particular bit of the security and defense sector and making it its own proxy. The Americans repeatedly have, singled out an elite unit for training. So the CTS was in fact retrained and rebuilt by the Americans after 2014. I very much doubt that politically it is really loyal to the Americans. I mean, in terms of who really runs it. But if you recall back in the early days of the American occupation, before 2011, the withdrawal, they had trained several Ministry of Interior brigades, the Wolves Brigade, I think it was called, for instance, who were elite units trained by the Americans for counterterrorism, who were entirely dominated by Badr and therefore by Iranian proxies. The Public Facilities Protection Force, which was massive, I mean, it had something like 300,000 people at one point in the mid-2000s, was heavily infiltrated by Mahdi's, by Jaish al-Mahdi, by Muqtada al-Sadr's militia. So this pattern of taking over a particular security or defense sector or ministry or body and making it, a political factional fiefdom is pretty typical. And certainly not just an Iranian thing, but I think what Renat finished with is the critical point, which is that Iran seeks influence inside Iraq through multiple approaches, including with the Kurds, including with Sunnis, including with all sorts of communities, partly in the security area and defense area, but also in other areas. And, whether that is to be the key point around which other international and regional players, such as Saudi Arabia or the US, if they make that the one thing around which they decide on their policy towards Iraq, I think that's going to be pretty problematic for the Iraqis.
Yes. Oh, yes.
I just got a follow-up question to Renat. So, so basically you're saying that there are large numbers of those Hashd al-Shabi fighters who, mostly the ones who followed Sistani's call, who actually would like to pack up and go home, right? And so I have two questions there, and I'm wondering about two things. So the one is, what are those people going to go home to? It looks to me, and it sounds like me, that they, from the whole Hashd structures, they're the least likely to have somebody to get them a job, because they're not going to have one of their leaders as a minister or one of their leaders with a block of 47 MPs. So that's one thing. And the other thing is, so if we think about this model of National Guard, which I think it's an interesting idea, as you said, Liz, there are many areas where it seems that IS is coming back. So additional security presence, if it's even people from the areas themselves, may not actually be a good idea and something that is really beneficial. But should we not expect that if such a National Guard is created, it's going to be those who now have these 47 MPs, who now can entrench themselves in the state and who have to be accommodated in one way or another, who are going to push their people into this National Guard? I would expect that the people who follow Sistani's call and have nobody to push them there, they may go home to be unemployed, and those people who are the Badr and others, they may end up in that National Guard, and then is it that then not going to be only a dual force, but almost a private force for one of them? How can that be prevented in this kind of in a scheme like this?
So I think on the question of the process, not they're all pro-Sistani, but the ones who we're talking about, they would be happy to be integrated into the state institutions. So obviously, if you can't offer them a job, they won't be happy. But if you can offer them some kind of role in the state security apparatus, they'll give up their flags and their uniforms and become part, quite sort of explicitly. So I think that's what it is. But yeah, I think you're speaking to a much bigger sort of question that's important in this case, which is the internal sort of rifts within the fighters, because it's not like all Hashd fighters are equal. And so you have ones who are favorited and ones who are not. And how that looks on the ground is when you're injured, I've heard some get treatment and some don't, even though they're all Hashd. Or some get salaries and some don't, right? So some of the Sistani groups complain that they give their names to Abu Mahdi, who's de facto in charge of determining who wins, who gets the money, and they get rejected, whereas other groups don't get rejected when they hand in names. So there isn't, the Hashd, because it's not monolithic, there's a huge internal split in it. And something that's important is, why do these people join? Obviously, at times of crises, it could be ideologically, but the way for the Hashd to remain, you can't just use ideological reasons to keep your base. You need to move towards material interests. And the Hashd is going to have to somehow be able to provide for its fighters. If not, there's going to be more and more internal disillusionment.
Yes, and to just follow up, something that came to me when Yazid was talking is that a lot of Iraqis call the counterterrorism service American Hashd. So, yes. And one thing I wondered about the report, it kind of makes an assumption that this is a challenge for the Iraqi state. This is a challenge that the Iraqi state wants to take on, and that it should do, I think the main recommendation overall is that it should proceed in incremental steps. But doesn't that rather assume that we're going to have a government that emerge out of this latest chaos that wants to contain or control the Hashd and wants to assert the primacy of the Iraqi state? Isn't it quite likely that, given the election results, that it might not be Abadi who becomes the next prime minister? He's certainly been very weakened lately. And we could end up with a very pro-Hashd government, certainly in control of the security ministries, And in that case, I mean, then what is the recommendation? Then what does Iraq do? What does Iraq face in the future? If you have a government that actually says, hey, that is actually Hashid-led and Hashid-controlled.
Fundamentally, the reason we took this assumption was we have to come up with some kind of policy recommendation, and chances are policy makers are going to make mistakes. So we're working within a very small confine as to what we could recommend people who always make mistakes. So I think that's important. As an academic, I can just criticize the problem, but as working for groups that want to advise these troublemakers what to move forward, we had to think of what's the best way to move forward. And fundamentally, we think that if the Hashid becomes part of the state somehow, it will have to increasingly be more held to account, not just by the state, but by the people. And that's why you're seeing the protesters are also now going against Hashid offices. So it's whether you want it to remain entirely out of the state or within the state. But fundamentally, the reason this plan to incrementally integrate, the idea behind it is, at some point, in this make-believe world of policymakers, is to make the Iraqi state more unitary and is to centralize the command structure of military. So it's not to say that there aren't going to be these autonomous groups, but that, if you're in the CTS or if you're in the Hashid, you're answerable to one institution. And you can't just get there right away, but you need to move sort of closer and closer toward there by strengthening the state. But what the alternative is you can't get rid of them. They're not going away. If you look at the MOI example, which I think is important, Badr weren't integrated into the MOI. The MOI was integrated into the Badr structure. So, obviously the track record is quite complicated when it comes to these things, but we have to offer these advice, and moving forward, we think this is the sort of the way it's going anyway. But so we need to understand how to kind of capture it.
Okay, and I have many more questions, but I'm just going to ask one quick one because the journalist part of me is interested, and then I will open the floor to questions from people here. So think about your questions. But the quick question I wanted to ask was, you only touch on this very briefly, but the kind of economic role that they're playing. And I wondered if you'd managed to get any sense of the scale of this. And we know they depend on funding from Iran, but do you see a point where they will, are they actually earning lots and lots of money? Are they going to be self-sustaining and perhaps earn some independence from Iran? Or what, did you get any sense of the numbers involved?
Yeah, I think, as Yazid actually said, Iran doesn't like to fund these groups. As soon as, Iran has its own funding issues. So it tries to build these groups that can become self-sustaining. It's a very lucrative country, Iraq. There are all sorts of different economies underway. There's all sorts of informal markets. There's all sorts of trade and smuggling and checkpoints. And one of the reasons why people from Basra are still going to fight is because they're being promised spoils, or they're being promised some reward for going to the front line. And as a Hashid leader who, if you don't have money, the best way to maintain support is to to some extent outsource your payment or your salaries. So I think there needs to be more work done on this, but quite certainly what we're seeing on the ground is a lot of these the informal economy, but also the formal economy. The Hashid groups are just like all the other groups taking advantage, and whoever controls territory in Iraq can control a lot of money.
So yes, who has some questions? Hello. Yes.
I am Marlene Khalifa. I'm a journalist. May I have ask my question in Arabic? Do you have any translation? Is it possible? أولا شكرا على العرض الشيق الذي قدمتموه عن الحشد الشعبي في العراق، ولكن أنا كلبنانية عندما تتحدثون عن هذا الموضوع أشعر كأنكم تتحدثون عن حزب الله في لبنان. نفس الموضوع، يعني الفارق بين الحشد والحزب هو نفس الموضوع ونفس الإطار ونفس السياق. سؤالي، إذا كان كما تحدث السيد يزيد صايغ أنه بالإمكانية أن يكون الحشد الشعبي جزءا من الدولة العراقية أو أن يكون حزب الله جزءا من الدولة العراقية، لأن لديه جناح سياسي وعسكري واقتصادي ناجح، ولعدم لكي لا يتحول إلى عنصر مواجه للدولة في المستقبل. هل هذا الأمر صالح ليكون لحزب الله في لبنان؟ ولماذا لدي شعور بعد هذا الحديث الذي سمعته منكم أن الدولة هي التي عليها أن تندمج مع الحشد الشعبي، والدولة هي التي عليها أن تندمج مع حزب الله وليس العكس؟ هل هذا الأمر صحيح؟ شكرا.
You guys answer. Yeah. Same time. Okay. Yes.
My name is Mohammed Sabaiti. What can be done, in your perspective, to reduce or mitigate the Iranian influence? Thank you.
Yes, this lady.
It's just a comment. I'm a Lebanese, and in 2009 I got my Iraqi nationality. But I need to stress that in the field, because I go on field visits to Iraq, the main concern is not the looming Iranian patron. There is the American and other patrons. The looming concern is as Dr. Yazid said, it's to have a proper state-controlled once and for all regulatory frameworks. Because even if Iran was addressed this concern that you have and this lady has, if there are not regulatory frameworks, we will have a recurrence as all Arab countries.
Okay. So let's take those three and then move on. Heiko, why don't you start?
I think I think most of those questions really go to you, Renat, right? So go ahead, and maybe I'll pick up with something left.
I won't.
Want to use it?
Yes. Do you want to tackle the Hezbollah?
Well, I'll tackle the first question from Marlene Khalifi about, I'll stick to English since I've been doing that so far. I'm not advocating anything. I'm simply observing that in quite a few Arab states, we have a reality, in some cases going back decades, in some cases more recent, where we have this dual structure, dual military structure. And we generally assume that states should have a single unified national army. It's what we've sort of inherited. Although even in Western countries, as I gave an example of the USA, for historical reasons, they often don't have a single military sector. It's often more diverse than we think. We think of one state, one army, we simplify this, and it's often more complex. And most countries, a great many countries have, they've got a carabinieri or a gendarmerie, which is part police, part military. Most countries are actually more diverse than we sort of assume. So I'm trying to remind ourselves that these patterns are not quite as strange as they seem, but also in this particular case, I think in Iraq certainly, I think in Lebanon, Syria, Libya, Yemen for sure, and a few others maybe, that this dual military structure is partly the result of the weakness of the state, which has its own reasons, the weakness of a national identity, the weakness of the social contracts. Citizens no longer feel that the state protects them in security sense, in the job sense, in various ways culturally, and that therefore they look to other forms of governance. And I think in a country like Iraq, as we've seen also in Syria and elsewhere, there are many people who no longer, who maybe want to be Iraqi, but no longer look to the Iraqi state to provide everything that they would normally want from their state. And that's where you get, either on an ethnic basis or a regional geographic basis or a tribal basis or others, you often get, we've seen in Lebanon too, political military organization that is partly outside the state, partly inside the state. After all, 20 years ago or more, the Lebanese forces were like Hezbollah in Lebanon. They ran a canton as a quasi-state while claiming to represent Lebanon and the Lebanese government. This is quite typical. Now, I'm not saying this is a good thing, I'm not saying it should stay, I'm just pointing out that these realities. In Lebanon, we've had duality for at least 40 years, and if you are only looking at Hezbollah, then at least for 26 years or so, or 27 years, or whatever. This has become part of the Lebanese political settlement. This is how the Lebanese made peace. Thanks to Syria coming in and imposing its rule, and many people didn't like that, fair enough. But it ended the civil war in a certain way and created our political settlement. And part of that was the amnesty law. We forget about everything that happened before '92. That was part of the deal. So different countries have these arrangements, and we may dislike them. I'm not saying we should like them. I'm not saying we should accept them forever. I'm simply pointing out that in Lebanon, Hezbollah has maneuvered itself, initially thanks to the Syrian Pax Syriana until 2005, and then later through other means, in a way where it is both part of the state and outside the state, in the way that we're seeing in Iraq. But as I've pointed out, this is not unique in these two countries. So I guess I'm saying I'm being a bit academic. I'm not sure that there's a clear solution to this. This is a political struggle, right? I mean, different people have different political views in this country about Hezbollah and the government. There was a time when people had different views about, the Lebanese front and its role in politics in Lebanon, and whether it should be, condemned for alliance with Israel and things. I mean, these are all political differences. They're not as simple as saying, well, it's very obvious that there can't be this and there can't be that. It's a political estimation. And I think in Iraq, we've got different ideas of the Iraqi state. Should it be Arab or neutral? Should it be Arab and Kurdish? Should it be pro-Iran, pro-Turkey, pro-what? We've had these struggles in Iraq since 1920. We had the phase when it was in the Baghdad Pact, and then it was pro-Nasser, and then it was... I think Iraq has not resolved any of these issues, and with the result that we see ISIS as one option, federalism as another option, which we've also had discussion of here and in Syria, and we now have this thing, which is another hybrid. I'm simply trying to suggest that we may not be able to resolve these things by clear political agreement, where Hezbollah, let's say, agrees to dissolve itself in return for what? I'm not sure. More seats in the parliament, better Shia representation? I'm not sure that that's only what they want. And that would be sufficient to lay down their weapons. So we may never reach, or not for the foreseeable future, reach a clear political agreement on these things, any more than in Iraq. But what we may be able to do is to say, okay, if we're going to have more than one defense force, nazmu ya shabab, as they say, let's have a structure. This defense force should have clear rules. Right now, Hashd al-Sha'bi, it was made a legal agency in a law passed by Parliament of 2 paragraphs. 2 paragraphs. We don't know. Do they have a pension system? Do they have a military justice code? What happens if one of them shoots a civilian? Do they go to military court, civilian court? They don't have a framework. Do they get training? Do they get told when they may fire their arms legally and when it's illegal to fire arms, as most armies train? So I'm just suggesting that rather than focus purely on duality and oppose it, I'm saying the duality may be unavoidable because of the political reality. That needs to be resolved, but it's got its ways to be resolved. It's part of international balances. Maybe it's a debate in parliament. Maybe you have a national dialogue conference, as they had in Yemen, which was pretty successful up to a point. But in the meantime, how do we regulate these things and provide them with standardized, rules of behavior for their financial behavior, for their field behavior in terms of what they do with their guns, in terms of training and qualification, and so on. Because if we are one day to make it possible to integrate, then you need them all to be on the same level in terms of their professional background. Because what's going to determine that will be the state of political struggle in that country. So, I'll leave the rest to Renad, certainly about Iranian influence.
And yes, the other question here was, what do you do to mitigate Iranian influence?
But just may add one sentence to to what Yazid said. I think one of the main ideas of this report is that on the policy recommendations is that the more of this military structure you can get into some kind of regulated into some kind of regulated state purview, the better, right? Because as long as they're outside, they're completely unaccountable, and some parts of it may even be converted into criminal structures. I mean, I think it's imaginable if you have the power of arms and it's completely outside any kind of regulation, it can be used for all kinds of things that you can't know about, right? So I think that's the main point, and perhaps, I don't know if we can say that perhaps Hezbollah in Lebanon is further along on that same way that the Hashd al-Sha'bi in Iraq should go.
Yeah, I mean, briefly on this point, I think in the report we refer to it as a tug of war. But if you view it as a negotiation process, the Hashd and their leaders are actively negotiating with the leaders of the state as to what their sort of relationship has to be. And so they have a high point, sort of a maximum and a minimum. And I've heard a wide array of what those maximum minimums could be. But obviously, with the state, as Yazid said, being so weak, it's very easy to negotiate with a prime minister who doesn't know really, or doesn't have a coherent security policy, with a Ministry of Interior that's quite divided. It's easy to negotiate. And because of that, they've been able to reach, often, I'd say, very close to their maximum point. I mean, they're in a very good position now because of this law, where blurred lines benefit the Hashd, right? Not having all these bylaws and legislation, regulation benefit. But that's not to say that they don't have to be susceptible to those if you just have a stronger negotiator on the other side, negotiating with them, right? Because they do still want to be part of the state. I mean, they're not anti-state as such. On Iran, I think it's easy to be anti-Iranian in Iraq. It's a very organic movement. I mean, most Iraqis are anti-Iranian. What the challenge has been is that other regional and international actors still haven't understood how to counter Iran at the narrative level, and how to counter Iran on the ground. Iran is very clear. I mean, even Masoud Barzani, the leader of the KDP in 2014, said, and this is a group that's very sort of has a problematic relationship with Iran, said when Turkey and everyone left us, Iran was the first to defend us against ISIS. So at times of crises, Iran constantly sort of makes itself appear to be protecting the political process. But nonetheless, you have a huge movement in Iraq right now, which is very anti-Iranian, because Iraqis are beginning to view Iran as the occupier. So those who used to be anti-American are now anti-Iranian in the same sense, including Muqtada. But also viewing Iran as being part of the political system that was built. So it's an organic process emerging, but putting Iran on the axis of evil at that level becomes problematic on the ground.
So, yes, let's take 3 more questions.
Yes, hi. Samar Radi from the Arab Weekly newspaper. Well, we've seen the militias being integrated after the end of the civil war here, integrated in the police force and the army. And, well, Hezbollah was the only exception for not dissolving their arms. We have seen the national dialogue for years trying to make a strategy for the national defense here with Hezbollah, and it didn't move anywhere. So as long as there is duality, as you said, of the military, I mean, there is no state, basically. And it is like, it's managing the time or managing the situation politically. So, I mean, what are the conditions to have a functional state? Otherwise, I mean, or is it, or we continue with duality, with no functional state, and what are the conditions for a functional state? Or this is my
let's
question.
ask this lady here.
Hi, Sohela Hayek. Thank you very much for your presentation. Beautiful, very eye-opening. I agree with almost everything that was said, except I cannot draw a parallel between the dual military system of, say, the US or Iran or Saudi Arabia, because the other military, quote unquote, is not led by a foreign force. by a foreign state. Whereas in Lebanon and in Iraq, the external, the dual, is not organic, is not from the country of origin. It's an outside force. So how can we imagine a situation where they could become part of the state, so long as the masters are others, whatever those others are? Iran plays a huge role in the region, but it's not by force. Those people in Hezbollah, in Hashd, they feel close to Iran. The Kurds, even though they fight with Iran, when they're in trouble, Iran comes to their help. So perhaps what we are seeing is not the failure of a state. Perhaps what we are seeing in states like Lebanon, like Iraq, is that it's an unfinished process. We are still trying to figure out what is it we want as a nation. Who do we want to be? Who are we? Where do our loyalties, our preferences lay? And I think that might be part of the problem. I don't think there is a quick answer for it.
Thank you. And let's ask one other person at the back there.
Hi there, my name is Mehdi, student in London at SOAS University. I just have a very basic, simple question. I'm curious to understand the panel's perspective more recently of Sistani's representative taking a slightly more harsh stance regarding the protests in Iraq. And I was curious if you see any more movement or action coming from Sistani's side, if there's going to be a bit more pressure this time around. Hopefully there will be, but I'd like to hear your perspective. Thank you.
So who wants to start with those three? Heiko, why don't you go ahead?
Okay. I'll just I'll comment on those 2 or 3 questions that relate to the state, and apologize for being being a bit academic for a second. I think what these questions show like an understanding or like an idea of a state that is like this bureaucratic, efficient rationality, working for the best of the community and all of this kind by clear rules and norms, and maybe that's a Weberian, we can call that a Weberian state idea, and it's kind of this ideal that is often in my perspective is often confused with reality, and the reality is that it does not exist in many places, and where it's really absent, it's not enough to just wish it into existence. It's not enough and it's often not very productive to hold this out as an ideal and then measure the processes that exist against it. If we look at the state, the different understanding of a state as simply a structure of domination, right? A force of domination that exists and that organizes society, then we can think about also different poles of domination, different poles of power, and we can think about trying to arrange them in a way that is at least not destructive. And where we can think about is trying to think, okay, how can we make this state, the structure of domination, less predatory than it is now? How can we control these predatory instincts? So I think now to be less academic again, for an organization like Crisis Group, it's basically, we're not looking at ideal state concepts or like as where societies should go, but we look at how the actual state structures that exist function, and if they're predatory, and if they're violent, and if they're exploitative, and all of this, then the question is: so what can be done to reduce those aspects, in particular reduce the danger that this evolves into conflict, that this escalates into conflict. So if we look at the question of the Hashid here, our question in a report like this is, I mean, these people are there, they're trained to, some of them have been trained to fight, others have the experience to fight, they know how to bear arms. What can be done with these groups? What can be done to reduce the danger that out of the success against ISIS, greater problems are created, future violence and future conflict is created. You know? If we go and operate with a normative state concept and say, well, I mean, they should not be there, they should not be this way, then I don't think we arrive at policy ideas or prescriptions that are very helpful.
And Renard, for your comments on those last few questions, and this has to be wrapping up as well because we're very much approaching the end of this. And then Yazid's wrapping up and comments on those last questions.
Okay, I'll answer the question on Sistani. We know that Sistani received a bit of internal trouble for not being as harsh initially in supporting the protest, and so the last Friday he came out, and quite simply, I mean, every time the sermon comes, you have to read between the lines, and there's never anything direct said. But it was a call that's been made since al-mujarrab la yujarrab, right? I mean, al-mujarrab la yujarrab did not come today, it was years ago. In 2015, Sistani said we need reform. So one has to question then, if Sistani doesn't want to have a direct influence, right? In 2014, Sistani said, and I don't mean to criticize Sistani, I mean, you know, I think that he has been needed in the past, but in 2014, Sistani said, join the state institutions. So they made the Hashid state institutions, and these groups went to join the Hashid groups. And we know that Sistani's office has criticized the Hashid in many of these groups, right? Again, indirectly. So yes, there is a role for Sistani, but I think one has to question how much Sistani is willing and able to directly influence the political process. In 2014, he did send a letter that got Maliki cut. So he does have an ability on small occasions to do this. But he's not going to go and say who his preferred candidate is. I think 2004 taught him as well. You can't really make yourself seen. But the rhetoric and the messaging that Sistani is trying to push across Iraqi, we're all Iraqi, I'm not just a Shia, but we're Sunni. I mean, there is good messaging, I think, the narratives that he's trying to form, but he faces a huge battle, and also he's a religious leader, so he needs to make sure the religious side of things are still coherent and not politicized. Finally, I'm going to go real quick on this whole state thing. Iraqi, I mean, it's a really good question. The process of the Iraqi state is still being negotiated, and I think that's Yazid's point. It's not the end. It's a spectrum, and quite a drastic 2003. It wasn't regime change in 2003. It was state change. They completely got rid of the army and the civil service. So it's being negotiated and negotiated. And so I don't know what the ideal type is, and I think we have different ideal types, but these are the realities on the ground. And how can we, in short and medium term, deal with these realities? And I think that's what we're trying to understand.
Well, I'll wrap up by saying, A, that Salma's question about Hezbollah, of course, takes us from Iraq to discussing Lebanon, and that's a very slippery slope in this location. But I think the important point that does nonetheless come out of that analogy is that whether it's Lebanon or Iraq or Syria or elsewhere, it's not that the Hashid or Hezbollah came first and created a crisis in the state. We have states in crisis. And that resulted in, the first civil war, then the long second civil war, PLO involvement, Syrian intervention, right and left, Christian, Muslim. I mean, it's not as if Hezbollah was part of all that. So, and it's the same for Iraq. So, I mean, at a certain point, yes, the existence of these militaries doesn't help resolve the crisis of the state, but I don't think that's the cause. Not historically the cause, but also even today. There was an earlier comment or question about that made me the thing about Iranian influence, I didn't want to take time and didn't respond to that, but I don't think the primary problem, in my view, is Iran's influence. I mean, I can dislike it or whatever, but we have governments that don't respect their own citizens. We are citizens. It's not clear what being a citizen means. I mean, are we actually citizens or subjects? You know, we have all sorts of problems with our states and our societies. And then, you know, Iranian influence is sort of an extra layer, but that's not, for me, my big worry. It's not my nightmare. Every Arab country we look at, there are fundamental issues with how those who govern us govern us. That, for me, is way more important than almost everything else. Now, every actor, whether it's those in power or those who push back against power, look for allies. They look for them in Iran, they look for them in Egypt if you live in eastern Libya, they look for them in the US, they look for them all over the place. And I'm not saying that's unimportant, I'm not saying maybe even it's secondary. I'm just trying to say, from my perspective, I'm trying to describe, and we're trying to discuss here, the particular case of the rise of a particular political phenomenon in Iraq, which is partly in this case Hashd-Sha'bi, but it happens in the Kurdish scene, it happens elsewhere in the Sunni community, where in order to conduct politics and be an actor in national politics, you organize a militia, bottom line. And I think that's a pattern we see in many Arab states, and it's a reflection of a deep historical crisis. And it may be, and you know, this repeats the point I think made by Sohail Hayek or by Rina just now, that if we're thinking of this in terms of historical process, violence is often the means through which history moves from phase to phase. I don't like that, I'm not advocating it, and I would like to bring it back under control, and certainly I think the duality is not something to advocate, it's something to redress, and certainly not to accept. But part of that may be, for instance, pushing Iran back, but not only Iran. We need to push several actors back, several international and regional actors back. I mean, Iran is not the only player playing this game with guns or the supply of weapons and military assistance and intervention in various forms. So I think, I mean, for me, it's useful not to exclude any of these other factors, but to try and zoom in on what is going wrong with our states. And for me, the duality that the Hashd bring out is interesting because the control of the means of violence is seen as one of the chief attributes of states. It's seen as one of the central political businesses of the state, to control and monopolize the legitimate use of violence. And when that monopoly is broken, as it is in so many of our countries, in terms of justice, you know, we have fractured justice systems, we have fractured police forces, and we have fractured armies. So I'm just using the duality as a way of understanding the weakness of these states and their failure to deliver basic governance. And that's why I also referred to the issue of financial management, economic management. I mean, how business is done in Iraq in terms of giving out public contracts, you know, is crony, is predatory, and is easily captured by different groups who will, you know, capture contracts or capture ministries in order to control financial flows, because finances are the second main pillar of state power, alongside guns. And if you look at it that way, then Saudi Arabia or Egypt and others are very vulnerable, because in all of them, those in power in the state bureaucracy often control who gets the contracts and who not. And even when you have a big private sector, often our private sectors are parasitical and depend on knowing the right people and bribing the right people in order to get the big contracts. And that's true of Lebanon, of Iraq, of Saudi Arabia, of Egypt, of Algeria, and elsewhere. So again, I mean, for me, it's really about understanding this crisis and pushing back on many levels, pushing back by asserting financial management, pushing back by asserting military management, pushing back by asserting, you know, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So yes, to combating Iranian influence, I think we do it by addressing these basic critical problems.
Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you all. I had many more questions, but we've run out of time. It's such an interesting topic. I don't think we've heard anything to mitigate the gloom that the Iraqis expressed, who I spoke to in Baghdad, expressed to me, but hopefully a better understanding of the subject. And yes, thank you, everybody.